Hello, my name is Conor Hickey, and I'm a research fellow at the University of Oxford, where I helped create the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Offsetting. My colleagues and I created the principles in autumn 2020 because of a growing need to align offsetting practices with net zero emissions targets. I'm here today to describe how the principles can help you purchase carbon credits in a way that aligns with net zero. I'll start by walking you through the principles and explain what each could mean in practice. With Principle 1, we captured existing best practice when it comes to offset use. That organizations must cut emissions, use high-quality offsets, and regularly revise their offsetting strategy as definitions of best practice evolve. Your first priority should be reducing your own emissions in line with a science-based target, since this minimizes the need for offsets in the first place. What remains after these reductions will vary by sector and over time as new climate solutions are developed. But in general, it is these hard-to-abate emissions, perhaps from air travel or heavy industry, that can be tackled in the interim with offsets. When using offsets from hard-to-abate activities, you must ensure the offsets are of high environmental integrity. Distinguishing between high and low integrity offsets is not always easy, but best practices for offsetting have developed over decades and can help guide us here. It is important you can verify an emissions reduction or removal took place, that there is a low risk of these emissions being re-released back into the atmosphere, and that the offset activity has not created negative unintended consequences for people and the environment. For example, purchasing a carbon credit that avoids deforestation can be very positive in theory, but in practice, it may have the unintended consequence of causing deforestation in another area, which could negatively impact the surrounding community and produce more emissions than intended. Offsets must also be additional. This means that you must be able to prove the carbon benefit would not have occurred before your purchase. Operators of some landfills in California, for instance, are legally required to install equipment that captures and destroys methane. The activity reduces emissions, but it's going to take place regardless of whether the creditor receives funding from credit sales. That means it wouldn't be considered additional. Once you've purchased offsets, you need to be transparent about the types of offsets you buy. Just as organizations should disclose their emissions, accounting practices, and net zero targets, they should also disclose offset use. For example, the SEC's proposed climate risk disclosure rule requests details on the risks associated with the availability of offsets and consequences of how the value of offsets can be limited by regulation, market changes, or write-offs to current offsets from re-released CO2. Principle 2 is about the type of offsets you should buy. I'll walk you through 2 questions that can help you understand the wide range of credits now available, with answers to each mapped out on the flowchart. The first is about how the credit is generated. Every credit is either an emissions reduction, also known as an avoided emission, or carbon removal. A project that protects existing forests from clearance, for example, leads to an emissions reduction because it avoids the emissions associated with deforestation. A project that creates new forest, on the other hand, generates carbon removal credits because the new trees capture carbon dioxide as they grow. The next question is whether the carbon involved is stored and for how long. New forests store carbon, but there's a risk that the carbon could be re-released back into the atmosphere due to fire or the landowner deciding to harvest the timber. Other removal solutions, such as direct air capture paired with geological sequestration, come with a much lower risk of such reversal. When we combine these 2 flowcharts, we get a taxonomy of credits. It can be challenging to do due diligence on an avoided emissions offset because estimating the project's impact requires us to imagine a counterfactual baseline, the quantity of emissions that would have been released if the offset project had not been funded. For carbon removal, this is much simpler because the counterfactual is not doing anything. Most offsets available today are emissions reductions, more than 96% according to a 2022 Bloomberg study. This matters because in our definition of net zero, any remaining emissions must be balanced with carbon removal, not avoided emissions credits. In the long run, the quantity of carbon credits from truly additional emissions reductions may not be sufficient to achieve net zero. Therefore, over time, organizations will need to shift offset purchases to 100% carbon removal in order to achieve net zero. In other words, we need to move the carbon removal side of the matrix. For example, the SBTi's recent advice on beyond value chain mitigation recommends investing in direct air capture. On the avoided emissions side, the initiative recommends an example of purchasing high-quality jurisdictional REDD+ credits for avoided deforestation. Creating demand for carbon removal offsets today will also signal to the market to increase supply, and the supply of removals must scale significantly if we are to reach net zero. Some companies pre-purchases from carbon removal startups in order to boost supply. This is an important mechanism for scaling up removal technologies, but there are substantial risks associated with claiming a removal today in your own carbon accounting that has not already occurred. It could be best to claim the removal after the activity has taken place when investing in future projects. The transition from emissions reductions to carbon removals is critical for achieving net zero, but it doesn't address the question of how carbon is stored. That brings us to principle 3, which is the need to shift to approaches that come with a low risk of being reversed over centuries to millennia, such as sequestration in geological reservoirs, as is currently being done on a small scale at this facility in Iceland, or mineralizing carbon into stable forms. Specifically, it's crucial that emissions are compensated for with like-for-like removals. Consider the emissions produced by continued fossil fuel use. They could theoretically be offset using nature-based approaches, such as restoring forests. However, biological storage can have higher risk of re-releasing CO2. It is difficult to guarantee that an acre of forest or farmland that has claimed to remove CO2 will store it there for millennia. Offsetting fossil carbon emissions by converting them into biological carbon carries an increased risk of the carbon being re-released in the atmosphere. Climate change can bring extreme weather events, such as forest fires, that put these carbon stores at risk. Increased vulnerability for forests may also arise when the climate in which the forests are growing becomes unsuitable for those forests. That's why emissions from continued fossil fuel use need to be offset using approaches that involve geological timescale storage, such as enhanced weathering or direct air capture with carbon storage. Biological storage through nature-based solutions will still be needed, of course, to compensate for biospheric emissions associated with food production or system feedbacks. Compared to CO2, agricultural emissions typically have a higher warming potential but are shorter lived in the atmosphere. Increasing the biosphere's global capacity may also improve its resilience to Earth system feedbacks. This doesn't mean that short-lived storage offsets aren't useful. They can help buy time to reduce emissions and to invest in long-lived storage, but they are not a long-term solution for achieving a balance between sources of fossil fuel emissions and sinks. It is therefore critical that investment in scaling up and improving technologies that enable long-lived storage begins now. Creating demand for long-lived offsets today sends a signal to the market to grow the supply of such offsets. Our final principle focuses on this kind of market building. The market for offsets we need to meet principles 2 and 3 is immature, and we need early adopters to support its evolution. So what can you do to support the development of a market for net zero aligned offsetting? One option is to use contracts for buying offsets in advance as a way to give the certainty required by project developers to create net zero offsets. For example, Frontier, a joint project between Meta, Alphabet, and others, is designed around advanced market commitments, low-volume pre-purchases of carbon dioxide removal based on an annual maximum spend. You can form similar alliances within your industry, where you will likely find common problems and solutions and work collaboratively to develop the market for net zero-aligned offsets. While some forms of biological storage can have relatively higher risk of reversal, your organization can still support nature-based solutions in their own right. Not only will this ensure the ecosystem goods and services on which humans depend, including resilience to the impacts of climate change, but it will contribute to carbon storage over the long term. While carbon offsetting can help to fund some of this work, such efforts should fundamentally be supported for the benefits and values they create, not purely for the purpose of carbon offsetting. You can also adopt and publicize these principles. Most of you are members of organizations that are at different stages in their net zero journey. If you are interested in aligning your offset use with net zero, the most important thing to start with is a credible and ideally independently verified net zero transition plan. Oxford Net Zero has a website with resources and tools to help get you started, including links to tools and standards to help you align your offset use with net zero, as well as guidance on the fundamentals of good net zero plans. Thank you for letting me walk you through these principles, and I hope what you learned today is useful as you develop and implement your strategy for carbon offsetting.